As a freelancer, you're a sales rep, you're a marketer, you're a designer, you're the project manager, and you're the intern.
I have that coffee you wanted?
That's good. 4 out of those 5 jobs really aren't that much fun. But here's the good news. If you do the project management side of things well, you can dramatically reduce how much you have to do things like sales and marketing. You do still have to be your own intern.
I have those copies for you.
Hang on to those for a minute. For most of the freelance designers and illustrators that I know, their bread and butter are reoccurring clients, whether those are individual clients or agencies that they work with on a reoccurring basis. It is way easier to keep your current clients happy than it is to go out and find new ones. So I have a plan. I need those copies. I am going to take an illustration project that I did, start you through from the beginning, how I structured that project, how I broke down that project, and then how I took it through to completion. Basically, the project management of it. How did I set up expectations for the client and then meet those expectations? Now, all designers have stories about bad projects or bad clients that they've had in the past. But here's the thing. Most of the time, a bad client is actually our fault. We turned them into a bad client. I know, I was surprised too, but here's the thing. If you manage your projects well, you can turn a lot of those bad clients into good reoccurring clients instead. All right, so here is my project brief. My cousin Meredith and her team are working for a nonprofit plant science institute. They are working on a presentation. It's for a TED Talk like event where they are competing against other teams for funding so they can further their research. The presentation they are making is explaining how you can expand crop yields by using new technologies like CRISPR to identify which genes in a plant make them stronger and more disease resistant so they could breed those crops so that those traits will continue on and they don't have to go in and modify the genes because genetically modified organisms or GMOs face a lot of regulations. It's probably a terrible description of what they're actually doing, but that's why they're creating a presentation with metaphors, with illustrations to hopefully clarify some of those points. So let's talk about the timeline. I was contacted on February 12th. My cousin and her team were presenting on March 7th. That gave me a little over 3 weeks to put together some of the illustrations they needed for their presentation to help them tell that story. Here's what I had to work with. I had a rough draft of the script that they sent me, and they also sent me audio of them practicing that script. They also let me know what they were looking for the presentation. For example, they wanted 3 main illustrations they could put on 3 separate slides that illustrated some of the key points that they were talking about. So with that, what I wanted to do was break down this project the way I might break down a proposal if someone first came to me with something like this. Whenever I break down a project, there are 3 primary things that I'm looking for. Time is the first one of those. How long is it going to take to do this, and how much time do they actually have for me to do it? The second one is, what am I actually making? What am I creating here? And the third one is budget. Is there enough money to do what they want to do? I will say this up front, it is very, very important to answer these questions honestly. And when you're answering those questions, don't think optimistically. Think pessimistically. I know this goes against the grain of how I usually think, but if I think something's gonna take a week, I usually like to pad it out because I'm really overly optimistic when I am breaking down my projects. So much better to err on the side of caution. Okay, so let's answer that first question. Number 1, time. They need this on March 7th. I received this on February 12th. That gives me about 3 weeks, but does it really give me 3 weeks? I couldn't start right away. And also in that first week, I had to kind of sift through the project and see what it was. So I really couldn't start that until the beginning of the next week. Plus, March 7th is their deadline. That's not necessarily my deadline. They need time to get those illustrations in the presentation and to practice that presentation. So really, I need to give a couple days leeway, maybe March 5th, 2 full days so that they can actually work with the illustrations that I get to them. And like I said before, I like to be pessimistic about this stuff. So I said my real deadline is Friday, February 29th. So my real time span to do this is actually 2 weeks. I figured Friday because it's the end of the week, it's a good ending point. And also, if I mess up, if I have underestimated what I need to do, I have some extra time to fill in the slots so that we won't totally miss that deadline. Question 2, what am I making? So I have 3 large illustrations that I need to do in 2 weeks. Can I do it in that time? Absolutely. That's plenty of time to do it. But if you're in this situation, you need to be honest with yourself. Are you working a full-time job? Well, that means you're only going to be able to actually work on this 2 or 3 hours a day when you're not at your other job. You also have to look at your schedule. If you're planning on doing a lot of work over a weekend or 2, are you going to be gone one of those weekends? Or maybe you need to relax over the weekends. Maybe you just need to recharge your batteries and you're not going to want to work on it on Sunday. Sunday afternoons. Those are things you need to take into account and really be realistic about. Since I was given the script, I decided to read through it and make a list of things that I thought might make good illustrations, even though they already had 3 recommendations there. And I decided to re-pitch the project. I don't always do this. Sometimes it's good to do, sometimes it's not worth doing. In this case, I thought it was, because there was a lot of areas that weren't going to be covered by the illustrations at all. And when I was looking at the illustrations that they wanted, I thought we could break those illustrations into pieces, and then they could use those pieces from the illustrations in other parts of the presentation. So what I repitched them was doing 2 large illustrations and then a handful of smaller illustrations that they could use on the rest of the slides. That would make the entire presentation look more cohesive. Like I said, I don't always repitch a project, but if you have the opportunity, or if they don't have the budget to do everything they want to do, but you're still interested in the project and they're still interested in working with you, it's sometimes worth it to go through the project and recommend something that you can do within their timeline or you can do within their budget. Or in my case, I had the opportunity to possibly improve their presentation, so it was worth recommending. The next big question is, what is their budget? Now, in this case, it didn't matter to me too much because I was doing this pro bono because I got to use it in a video. However, oftentimes I'm really factoring this in. Do they actually have the budget to afford what they want to do? A lot of times a client comes to you because they have no idea what this sort of thing costs, and that's fine too. You can throw out a basic example before you do a lot of this research, just to give them a ballpark of what they're going to be looking at. So once those questions are answered, it's time to break this down and actually make your schedule. Now, the client dictates what the deadline is, but I like to dictate micro deadlines within that. There's a couple reasons why I do that. One, I like to break every project down into chunks because it's just easier to manage that way. The other thing I don't want to do is I just don't want to disappear for 2 weeks and then show up and say, ta-da, here are your illustrations. I want to communicate with them along the way, let them know what's going on and get their feedback as I go. So what I did is I took each week and broke it in half. And I decided that every Wednesday and Friday, I was going to present them with some work. In that first chunk, I was going to give them the initial sketches that I was working on for all of the assets. In that second chunk, I was continuing to work on some of the sketches, but I was also going to be doing some explorations into what kind of styles we could work with. The second week would be taking those sketches, doing any revisions that were necessary, and then actually taking the ones that were approved and putting them out in the full style that we had agreed on. And then in that fourth chunk, if I needed more time, which I was pretty sure I would, and I ended up needing it, I would continue to work on those finalized illustrations. That takes me to my February 29th deadline, so that still gives me plenty of time if we need it. So here's a pro tip: set mini deadlines as you go. The client's gonna set the main deadline, but you have the opportunity to set little deadlines as you go. For example, I set a small deadline for the sketches as Wednesday. Now, I thought I was gonna be done with the sketches on Tuesday, and I was, but that gives me the opportunity to give them something before they expect it. This helps build trust and it lets them know that you're working on something. Especially on larger projects, if you're working for weeks and weeks at a time, you want to share as much as possible as you go, because it's inevitable as the projects get larger, they get harder and harder to estimate, and there's a pretty good chance occasionally you're going to miss a deadline. However, if you're meeting small deadlines as you go, and then eventually you miss a deadline here and there, the client's going to forgive you because they know you're working hard and you've built up trust as you went. We had our first plan call on Wednesday the 20th. They went over some of the sketches and I got some really good feedback. They told me which sketches they might not need. We added a couple more that they had added to the presentation as they were going, and we had some good conversations about how the presentation was going to flow. Also, by giving them those sketches, they were able to take them and plop them into the presentation that they had. And since they were able to put them in the presentation when we had the next status call, they were able to make recommendations that would make the illustrations better. Okay. Another quick pro tip: at the end of every single phone call or chain email where you're discussing your project, here are some things you need to do. The very first thing I do is I reiterate what we talked about on the phone call, and then I say, this is what we decided on. Number 2, I tell them this is the next step I am going to take and what I will be working on next. And number 3, I tell them this is when I expect to be done with it. These tips are insanely simple to do, but you would be surprised at what a difference they make. By saying this is what we decided upon in this phone call, it gives people the opportunity to say, no, I don't think that's what we decided on. Or it gives the people on the phone call time to realize that they had all decided on a separate thing. And sometimes the phone call has to to keep going so we can actually decide on one thing, because you'd be amazed at how often a meeting concludes without actually a decision being made. Number 2, I don't always know what's going to happen next. So if I tell people this is what I'm going to do next, it gives them the opportunity to either say, yes, it's a good idea, or say, no, it's not. Basically taking one more choice out of the client's hands and making their lives easier. If they want to change what you're doing, that's fine. But clarifying that at the very end of the meeting could be really helpful. And then of course, third, just being able to set your own deadlines and telling them when to expect it so they don't create their own deadlines or unrealistic expectations. Also in that meeting, we had the opportunity to start talking about style. One of the things I learned is for a good chunk of their presentation, there was going to be nothing on the screen. And when there was nothing on the screen, it was just going to be a black slide. And so we didn't want the style to be big and bright, because when they changed from a black slide to one of the illustrated slides, it was going to be super bright and it was going to blind the audience. That had a huge effect on the style and how we were eventually going to create those icons. This is what we settled on. Basically blue line drawings, which were very similar to the blueprints that we were using throughout the presentation. And then the important elements within those illustrations oftentimes got a lighter blue background to help them stand out. I also layered the larger illustrations so that they could take elements and add them as they were talking about things. This really didn't take me any time, and I like to draw in layers anyway, and it had a dramatic effect on what they could do within their presentation. In the end, what I ended up having were 2 big folders filled with a bunch of transparent PNGs that they could place into their presentation as they needed. I ended up handing over all of the illustrations on the Friday as we originally planned, so I didn't need any of that extra time. So they were off to the races. They had plenty of time to finish up. So how did they do? Drum roll. They ended up getting first place. Woo! In other videos, I have talked about things like how you set your hourly rate and figure out what you're worth, and also how to find some of those early freelance clients when you're just trying out. I'm gonna link those up here at the end of the video, but if you have any comments or questions, let me know down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you in a couple of days.